Welcome to another week of the Fall Conservation Sciences seminar series. Before we get started, if you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to put those questions in the chat, or if you're brave, you can hold the question till the end and feel free to unmute yourself. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Wilkinson. She is a conservation biologist and postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research interests include human-wildlife conflict, carnivore movement ecology, multidisciplinary mapping, and using participatory methods for more effective and inclusive conservation outcomes. She has spent the last decade working in conservation biology and natural resource management around the USA and in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and has also served in various capacities as an informal educator. For her current work, she is studying the socio-ecological drivers of urban carnivore movement and conflict in the Bay Area. She's also using remote sensing and GIS analyses in conjunction with participatory mapping to understand landscape permeability for carnivores, livestock predation, and perceived human-hyena conflict risk, and the intersection between human and carnivore resource needs in and around Lake Nakuru National Park in Kenya. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Wilkinson.
Thanks for that awesome introduction, Jack. I'm gonna do the whole share my screen slowly thing that we all are familiar with. And just let me know if you can see that. I can just say something because I can't see you anymore. Good?
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. I am currently talking with you all from Berkeley, which is the unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. And today I'm going to share with you a story about what it might look like for humans to coexist with wildlife. Let me start you off with something I feel that many of us often take for granted. And that is that large carnivores and other wildlife live alongside people in even the most pristine landscapes. And we now know that separating people from wildlife is unrealistic, and that interactions between people and carnivores are complex and they can shape the environment at many different scales. So to address this complexity and understand how humans and wildlife can share landscapes over the long term, my colleagues and I are bringing in local community perspectives and combining them with what we know about ecology and animal behavior. So today I'll be walking you through a story about human-carnivore conflict, illustrated by some of my dissertation work. And then I'll talk briefly about some of the work I'm doing in the Bay Area on these issues. So if there's one thing from today that you should pay attention to, it's this basic concept, human-carnivore conflict. Human-carnivore conflict is our way of describing the negative interactions that can happen between carnivores and people or their livestock, as well as people's perceptions of risks that carnivores pose. So a negative interaction might be a puma killing someone's goat or even chasing a person while they're hiking. And it also includes human actions like human retaliation toward pumas, whether it's legal, such as a permit to shoot the offending puma, or illegal, like poisoning or other methods. Meanwhile, maybe you've been out on a hike or a bike ride. You've been worried about what it might be like to encounter and be attacked by a puma or even another animal, even though those events are extremely rare. But those perceptions are also very important. Perceptions influence actions like retaliation, and they also influence acceptance toward carnivores and legislation about them. So today I'll be using 3 brief case studies from my work in Kenya to illustrate the factors that we should think about when trying to manage these conflicts and move toward coexistence. So for our first case study, we wanted to look at how well the tools we are using for coexistence are actually working. And what I mean by tools is this. So around the world, people have used many different tools and methods to try and stop carnivores from attacking and killing livestock. So for example, at my field site in Kenya, the Conservancy uses these livestock enclosures that also have an opaque mesh to prevent predators from seeing in to the livestock. Another common tool is livestock guardian dogs, which we can all imagine what that dog's job is. And as another example, there's flattery, which scares wolves away for at least a period of time. And there are many, many other types of tools being used around the world. But we don't really have a lot of scientific evidence for how effective these tools are at protecting livestock and keeping predators away. So this is why for our case study, we wanted to see whether and how fences in particular are working as a tool for coexistence. But before I talk about the effectiveness of fences, I'd like to set you up with some background. Our story today is set in the Rift Valley of Kenya, in and around two protected areas. Lake Nakuru National Park, which is to the west, is one of only two fully fenced national parks in Kenya. Soisambu Conservancy to the east is a wildlife conservancy that is also a livestock ranch. And Nakuru City to the north is one of the fastest growing cities in East Africa. There's also really, really dense human development around both protected areas. And I'll give you some more context about this area to really set the stage for the rest of this part of the talk. First, this photo is a great example of the dense development and agriculture completely surrounding the two protected areas. And Soisambu Conservancy, seen here, has both domestic and wild animals closely sharing the same spaces. Then issues around wildlife are deeply controversial. So this might look like a photo of the military, but it's actually the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is militarized largely to stop poachers. And because of all of this, the surrounding communities have a really complex relationship with the protected areas. Lastly, this electrified fence around Lake Nakuru National Park was erected in the 1980s to keep rhinos within the sanctuary, but it's also currently used to prevent human-wildlife conflict and to mark the park boundary. So there are a lot of shifting stated purposes of the fence that influence how effective it is as a coexistence tool, as you'll see. As I mentioned before, sharing landscapes with people means that carnivores and other wildlife have to navigate human activity and infrastructure. And fences are a major part of this infrastructure. So in fact, the length of fences that are wrapped around the earth could likely reach the sun. And around the world, the fencing of protected areas in particular is increasing. But the implementation of these fences for conservation has really outpaced their assessment. And the effectiveness, the non-target ecological impacts, and the long-term costs of conservation fencing have been insufficiently studied. In 2013, the debate began in earnest around conservation fencing and its effectiveness and overall contributions to conserving wildlife. So when I say conservation fencing, I'm mostly referring to protected areas that are fully fenced, usually with parallel electric wires, like you can see in these images. So first, Craig Packer and a group of other authors argued that overall fenced protected areas are very effective at conserving lions and bolstering their populations. But then another group of authors put out a rebuttal to that argued against this for a number of reasons. So afterward, there have been a few other papers calling for more targeted research to help us understand when and where conservation fences might be most needed and most effective. But very few people have answered that call to research fence effects so far. So that's what we set out to do. First, I wanted to understand how animals are actually behaving at the fence line. So we created a way to classify mammalian fence-specific behaviors from still camera trap imagery. So for our purposes, the most important behaviors were observed fence crossings into and out of the national park, as well as carnivores searching or attempting to cross. So for instance, in this bottom left image you see here with the leopard, we can see that that leopard is kind of shoving its face into a hole that we've seen other leopards cross on before. And there hasn't been any fence maintenance in this area at all. But the camera limitations, the settings, prevented us from seeing whether this leopard actually crossed. So that's what we use as an implied crossing. So for carnivores in particular, we used confirmed versus implied crossings as an uncertainty measure, in particular for all of our analyses. What we're seeing is that there are over 170 weak points along the national park fence, which you can see on this map. And even though spotted hyenas were the most likely to cross the fence, often doing what I like to call downward facing hyena, as you can see in the bottom right, we also saw a wide variety of other carnivores crossing in and out of the park on a daily basis. And overall, mammals in general are approaching and moving through the fence much more than we thought. So across 2,800 cumulative trap nights, we saw 65,000 detections of mammals approaching the fence and about 3,600 fence crossings. And out of the 38 species that approached the fence, 27 of them crossed at least one time. Carnivores in general had the highest crossing to approach ratio, both for observed and implied crossings. And the crossing to approach ratio is essentially the number of times an animal crossed the fence if it approached, rather than doing other behaviors. So for example, all the way on the left in this plot, if a spotted hyena approached the fence, there was about a 50% likelihood of it crossing the fence. We also ran logistic regressions on our behaviorally classified camera trap data to see which variables correlate with animals crossing the fence versus doing other behaviors at the fence line. This chart shows the percent likelihood of crossing versus performing other behaviors across variables retained in each group's top model. So the all taxa group and the ungulates were the only groups that had a good or outstanding model. Meanwhile, carnivores and primates had much weaker top models, meaning they were much less predictable as broad groups in where and when they crossed the fence. And when combining all mammal taxa, the most important driver was adjacency of the crossing site to Soisambu Conservancy. And all taxa were actually less likely to cross at sites of low human activity, which is something that we're studying further. We are also interested to see that microhabitat at the fence hole was important in these models. This implies that the visibility in the area and perhaps the animal's perceived immediate risk really matters strongly when choosing whether to cross the fence. Here's an example of a hyena's vigilance at the fence hole, where the microhabitat might be important for this animal. These behaviors make us wonder whether animals are using extra energy or having higher stress levels from making these decisions about where it's risky to cross the fence. Now, related to stress and energetics, as I said before, carnivores and primates were more likely to cross at sites of high human activity. But human daytime activity seemed to mediate this effect at a fine temporal scale. So for example, primates approaching and crossing the fence at sites of high human activity seemed to shift their behaviors to be centered around noon. This could be because this study site is pretty much on the equator. So most human activity happens in the morning and in the late afternoon rather than during the heat of the day. So this activity at noon for primates might also be having some energetic consequences for them. And lastly, these holes in the fence are also being fixed and maintained. So we wanted to see whether maintenance is actually stopping animals from crossing out of the national park into the communities. And what we've seen is that patching up these holes has essentially no effect on wildlife crossing. And when the fence is fixed, wildlife often breach the hole again within a single day, as you just saw. What if all of these environmental and animal behavior patterns are different than people's perceptions? Incorporating participatory mapping with other methods is one meaningful way to understand how human perceptions and values interact with and influence ecology and animal behavior. And we can use participatory mapping to involve communities in the research process and to gain spatially explicit community perspectives that help us as scientists to understand the dynamics of conservation challenges, and most importantly, just and sustainable solutions to those challenges. For this part of the study, we compiled data on verified and perceived livestock predation by carnivores. So what I mean by verified is that, for instance, someone who experienced an attack on their livestock might call Kenya Wildlife Service. And then Kenya Wildlife Service has a process to collect evidence and verify which animal was attacked and by which carnivore species. Because we know that human perceptions are so important for conservation outcomes, we also wanted to see how people's perceptions of livestock being killed by carnivores were different from the livestock killing events that the government had recorded in this region. So to do this, we held community mapping sessions with about 400 community members from 16 different villages near these two protected areas. And for these mapping sessions, community members participated in one-on-one interviews, and they were assigned a unique pen color for drawing on the map so that we could associate what they said in their interview with what they drew on the maps. We were asking them questions about their risk perceptions about carnivores, locations of livestock attacks they had experienced, and their attitudes toward carnivores. We then digitized these maps using fieldpapers.org, which uses this QR code you see in the bottom right corner and reference points to georeference the photo of the completed map. So basically associating the photo of the map with coordinates. And for those of you who have done digitization before, you know that this really cuts out a very, very difficult, tedious step in the digitization process. From this process, we were able to see that about 20% of the study area showed a mismatch between people's perceptions about livestock kills and the livestock kills that were recorded by the government. So for instance, these areas in red are places where people had drawn on the map places that they had experienced a lot of different livestock attacks by carnivores, and where the government hadn't logged as many verified, quote unquote, evidence-based attacks on these people's livestock. And the opposite holds true for the blue. So those are areas where the government had logged quite a lot of livestock predation events, and the community had logged fewer when they were doing the participatory mapping sessions. So our hunch about there being big differences between these two data sets turned out to be correct. And we now know where specifically to focus community outreach efforts. What predicts these differences? Since we knew from the fence crossing analyses that carnivores are moving through the national park fence into community lands, we wanted to see if distance from the protected areas predicted the difference. We also wanted to see whether season or vegetation resources can explain the difference between these two types of conflict, since we know that this is typically a factor when looking at verified conflict. And we used road density as a proxy to understand how anthropogenic activities may or may not explain the disparity in the two data sets. We found that with increasing distance from protected areas, both verified and perceived conflict decreased, which is what we predicted, because as we remember, these weak points in the fence, right? We also found that road density was positively correlated with both verified and perceived conflict. This could be because where there are people, there are more roads. And in this region, human population density is increasing due to a boom in immigration. And wildlife in this densely developed area are likely more nocturnal. So people are likely experiencing carnivore conflicts at night near their homes rather than during the day while animals are out to pasture in open or less road dense areas. Vegetation greenness had opposite effects on perceived and verified conflict. So NDVI, which is a measure of vegetation greenness, was positively correlated with perceived conflict and negatively with verified conflict. This could be, we think, due to overinflation of perceived conflict in and near highly vegetated regions that carnivores could be more likely to use as habitat. Diving more deeply into the perceived conflict data set, what about people who are guarding their livestock actively at night, but are still reporting perceived conflict? Are there any notable regions where nighttime guarding of livestock might not be working? And from this map, we can actually see that there aren't any notable clusters in perceived attacks reported by people who are guarding their livestock at night. When we used geographically weighted logistic regression, we saw that there were local regions where certain social perceptions and values might be influencing in excess of perceived conflict reports for people who guarded their livestock at night. So for instance, here I've circled two regions showing clusters of perceived conflict where people tend to guard their livestock at night. And these clusters are predicted by these participants' beliefs that their children face threats from carnivores while traversing those landscapes. Similarly, on this second map, we can see that this cluster is predicted by participants' beliefs that there is a shortage in wild prey. So managers can use these local clusters and their unique predictors to decide on targeted outreach for these particular communities. So for instance, are the people in these regions facing threats from carnivores due to the fence being breached more in those areas? Or are there ways to provide these particular communities with transport for their children to get to school without needing to walk and face these real or perceived threats, etc. What's interesting here is that despite reporting high numbers of perceived livestock kills, most participants in this study actually thought that carnivore conservation is important. So we've also seen that people who had visited the national park had more positive views toward carnivores, which shows us that if we're trying to have coexistence between humans and carnivores, we need to really make sure these communities have a way to visit their nearby national park and connect with wildlife. We also wanted to understand how all of these human factors influence animal behavior and perceptions, and how carnivores are perceiving and moving through these landscapes. So to do this, we used spotted hyenas as a case study. Now, spotted hyenas are known to attack and kill a lot of livestock across Africa. And we know that they're very clever and they're able to adapt in human-dominated landscapes. But we don't really understand how they move in relation to people and infrastructure. So hyenas can really give us a window into how carnivores around the world are adapting to the human-caused changes in these rapidly developing landscapes. So first, we wanted to see where these hyenas are living and moving generally, and how does that compare to places without as much human development? So we put GPS collars on a subset of the hyenas representing 5 of the 7 clans in this area. We saw a few interesting things. So on the left, we have a subset of hyena data across 3 days to show an example of their fine scale movements. And on the right is a map showing their home ranges based on their collar data. So one thing that we're seeing is that many of these animals are moving to and from the conservancy and the national park routinely, as exhibited by this on the left side. You can see the blue track, that one goes every single day. They're also going into each other's territories a lot more than normal. So this is really important to note because hyenas have intricate social structures where every animal has a particular rank. So along with this social rank, they're also very territorial. So you don't typically see hyenas going into other clans' territories. We think that this high overlap could be because there just isn't very much space in these small, isolated, protected areas, but we don't really know if that's affecting their social structures and what it means over the long term. So are these animals actually adapting to this constrained landscape, or is there some sort of long-term effect that we're not seeing? But because we want to see whether and how animal behavior and resulting conflict is influenced by human factors, we wanted to figure out if we can use what we know about the landscape to predict where hyenas will choose to go. And what we're seeing is that how hyenas choose to move depends on the scale that you're looking at. So at a broader scale, using resource selection functions, the places that the hyenas go can best be explained essentially by everything that we analyzed, which means ecological factors like vegetation and water, as well as human infrastructure and tolerance. Meanwhile, when looking at how hyenas are choosing to move at a finer scale using step selection functions, we discovered that this finer scale immediate decision-making was best explained by just human infrastructure and human perception. So this shows us that different types of factors like ecology and human perceptions may have different importance for hyena behavior, depending on what scale that you're looking at. Our analyses also revealed that hyenas living in the national park in particular were selecting against boundaries, which was a little surprising at first. But then we further explored the data with a really useful barrier behavior analysis method developed by Wenjing Xu, who's a PhD student here at UC Berkeley. And we found that when hyenas approach fences, they're either quickly crossing or quickly walking away from the fence. They aren't exhibiting any of the other behaviors such as tracing or pacing along the fence. So this means that despite crossing frequently, the hyenas could be viewing the boundary fences as risky and not wanting to spend any more time than necessary near them. And you can see on this plot, I've included some examples of what I mean by some of these behaviors. So the bounce behavior is when an animal approaches the fence and walks away quite quickly. The quick cross is when an animal, it is what it sounds like, crosses very quickly without loitering. And then the trace is kind of this behavior where the animals are loitering around the fence, tracing along it, maybe coming back, and a lot more like tortuous kind of path. And so the animals aren't really doing that in this case, likely because it's just so developed and there's so much human activity around this park and around the conservancy as well. From this barrier behavior analysis, we're able to get some idea of the permeability of different sections of the boundary fences. And all of this will contribute to ongoing conversations about corridor planning in this region. So for instance, creating a rhino-proof fence and maybe a wildlife overpass to connect the park to the conservancy at this spot right here, where they're adjacent. And this is actually really exciting because this could be maybe the first wildlife overpass that they create in Kenya if they choose to go this route. And they already, even before hearing about the hyenas, which people don't necessarily care about as much, they were already interested from a management perspective of perhaps opening this up somehow in a way that would still protect the rhinos here. So stay tuned for that. Lastly, we've also been using hyenas' individual spot patterns to see which individuals crossed the national park fence and how often. Now, thinking again about hyena social structure, we expected the lower ranking hyenas to be taking the risk to cross out of the park more often. But so far, we've logged nearly 200 individuals of all social ranks crossing at just 8 of the sites, which was super shocking to us. So what this means is that social rank might not play as strong of a role as we thought in navigating human risks in this study area, and that the outside of the park might be serving as an important part of the hyena's range. And the other interesting thing to note here is that most of these 200 individuals are actually animals that den inside of the national park, which is this super protected area, but they're still seeking to leave the park at night. And we're sitting here wondering and trying to figure out now, why aren't the hyenas that are living in Soisambu Conservancy, which has all of those livestock and all of those people and more threats to the hyenas, why aren't those animals coming into the protected area? Why is it flipped? And it might be perhaps something along the lines of the hyenas from the park going in for an easy food source in the conservancy with these kind of carcass dumping locations that they have there, or for just actually going in and trying to get the livestock that are alive. Maybe there's some sort of resource limitation in the national park. You might have noticed on the map that I showed of the national park that there's a huge lake inside of that park called Lake Nakuru. And right now it's gotten so big that it takes up about 1/3 of the park's area. So it's not unreasonable to think that these animals might be crossing out because they're facing some sort of resource shortage or competition with one another. But that remains to be seen. So to recap these Kenya case studies, we learned that the effectiveness of conflict interventions is complicated. In the case of our fence, carnivores are still crossing, and fixing the gaps in the fence doesn't really seem to help. We also learned that involving the community while also taking into account the ecology can help us to more deeply understand human-carnivore conflict, while also elevating the voices of community members. And finally, we've learned that carnivores' perceptions also matter. Even our most adaptable carnivores, like hyenas, are choosing their movements based on both ecological factors and human perception and tolerance. So in the words of Dr. Ian Malcolm, in these shared landscapes, life finds a way, but not without considerable risks and challenges that require holistic and inclusive approaches to try and unpack. So pivoting a little bit, if you've ever wondered how coyotes, raccoons, and even pumas navigate the city and its people, that's what I'm currently launching into. So I'm taking these ideas home to where I live, which is the Bay Area. And for my postdoc, I'm working with Dr. Chris Schell to understand the impacts of inequality, gentrification, and other socioeconomic factors on carnivore movement and wildlife communities here in the Bay. And I'm also really excited to finally be working in a place where I've now lived for about a decade and involving my own community in the work, It's been kind of exciting to be the holder of the traditional ecological knowledge in this space. And it's already been really helpful for some of my lab mates to help them figure out where to do certain studies. So it's kind of interesting to be in that role now. So as an example of social and cultural factors influencing wildlife ecology, I just wanted to share Chris's paper from last year, which is called The Ecological and Evolutionary Consequences of Systemic Racism in Urban Environments. So essentially, this paper is showing how systemic racism leads into structural racism and classism, which dictates how various elements are designed and laid out and prioritized in urban environments. So this includes aspects like infrastructure, pollutants, and green space, among others. And all of these aspects can influence ecology and evolution. And I just want to make a note here that although this paper is about urban environments, where these sort of layers of the city are easier to study because of data availability, systemic racism and other systemic kind of class and race and economic issues actually influence these landscapes similarly, even in rural areas and in these kind of edge developing areas like where I work. It's just a lot easier to frame and to study in cities. So for example, we have redlining, which was essentially a formally legislated way from the 1930s to the 60s to deprioritize Black neighborhoods for funding, to suppress the wealth of Black neighborhoods, and to prioritize pouring wealth into white neighborhoods. So these effects can be seen in urban segregation even today and have a number of ecological impacts. So for example, this study found that these redlined D neighborhoods, you can see outlined in red on the map, have about a 21% less tree canopy than the A neighborhoods, those wealthier kind of historically white neighborhoods. And that's just the tip of the iceberg on these ecological effects. So I'll be taking some of these ideas a little bit further to understand how these factors influence human-wildlife interactions and also wildlife movement at different scales in the Bay Area and in LA. And in keeping with my focus on misunderstood animals, I've worked on hyenas, I've worked on baboons, I've worked on gulls, snakes. I'll be working pretty heavily on coyotes, another misunderstood animal, for the duration of this project. Which is why I included this video we just took recently, just down the road, about 10 minutes in Blake Garden. So human wildlife conflict and interactions are particularly stark in cities. So some of you may have heard about this report of a woman hand feeding coyotes all over San Francisco recently. And the Animal Care and Control put out sort of a bulletin saying, if you find this woman, send her to us. She's going to have a $10,000 fine. It's actually illegal to feed coyotes or any sort of wild animal in the city. But it's especially not great to feed coyotes because feeding contributes to boldness and to negative interactions with people. And then eventually that coyote is going to end up being euthanized if it's caught. So for example, right now I'm looking through some the San Francisco Animal Care and Control database on coyote sightings and interactions, which is an amazing database has about several years, maybe starting in 2017. And you can kind of see the trends over time. And the boldness, people are really starting to notice that the boldness for these coyotes is increasing, probably not just due to this woman feeding the animals, but also due to things like people leaving food out for feral cat colonies. And the coyotes taking advantage of that, among other things. So as an example from this data set, you have this person's report, a solo adult coyote aggressively charged my toddler with a clear intent to attack her throat this morning. So in the middle of the day in Golden Gate Park, my toddler was playing in the middle of the field. We were far away from the coyote den and far away from the one sign about coyotes. This coyote seemed to have an unusual comfort toward attacking a human child next to a human adult. It was inches away from my child's throat with multiple eyewitnesses, many who assumed she had been attacked due to the proximity the coyote made to the baby. This is a thing that has been happening since at least last December, and I'm shocked and I'm thankful that my child didn't die today. So these are crazy, like very big, intense, important emotions that people are feeling about these animals because of real danger. And I think that it's having cities as sort of our microcosm of these attitudes is super important to study, because not only because of the danger that these interactions can pose for people, but also, going the other way, like how people's actions, including this woman here feeding the coyote, can have impacts on the coyote populations over time. So in cities, we're also, as I mentioned earlier, fortunate to be able to use some widely available socioecological data streams to understand what's driving how carnivores are moving and interacting with people. I included this a screenshot from this paper by White et al. In 2009, and it's been a really big inspiration for some of my work. So basically, they were arguing that we need to include all of these multifaceted spatial layers to be able to predict the likelihood of these conflicts. And the same holds true for cities. And cities have so many widely available data streams because often people are paying taxes that then contribute to the collection of those data. And then those data are freely available most of the time. So we're talking things like housing density, infrastructure, green space, and the luxury effect, which also relates to redlining in some cities, human demographics, gentrification, et cetera, along with our ecological layers that we're accustomed to using for understanding animal movement. You can also use alternative data streams like Nextdoor to try and understand people's perceptions and community experiences. So, for example, I have this interaction I screenshotted from my neighborhood in Oakland. Person is complaining about how there's a family of coyotes being fed by a neighbor of theirs, and that the coyotes are now following the people and their dogs down the street in the middle of the day, and they're getting nervous. So that goes back to that boldness increase that I mentioned before. And then there's a follow-up from the same person. She spoke to the person named John, who's feeding the coyotes. And she says, we spoke at length and he feels he's doing the right thing for them. I pointed out all the ways this is not helping the coyotes or the neighborhood, but got nowhere with the conversation. And so she's going to end up calling animal control on him and all these things. So there are, all of this sort of goes back to our, what we say in the human wildlife conflict world is that a lot of these, if not all of these human wildlife conflicts are actually human conflicts, right? There are these aspects about people's attitudes, about sociopolitics, about neighbor interactions. There's different scales of these human conflicts that influence human wildlife conflict. So you have to ask yourself, even if I map out all of those layers that I mentioned on the previous slide, and we're able to make really good predictive models of where the coyotes will move and how they'll interact with people, we can't really predict when this lady or when this guy here are gonna go around feeding coyotes all over the city. And how do we incorporate those people in the same way that we would incorporate things like individual variation in coyote behavior and boldness into these models and into these understandings of what's going on a broad scale? And those are sort of the questions that I'll be asking with my work. So these types of holistic multidisciplinary efforts are particularly important because not only are conflicts between people and wildlife not going anywhere, they're also exacerbating with climate change. So there was this great paper put out by my colleague, Brianna Abrams, where she outlines a lot of different ways that climate change is intensifying conflicts between people and wildlife. So for instance, animals are in need of more resources because of climate change induced impacts on them, or their ranges are in some cases being shifted to overlap more with people. And so by 2025, most of the world's human populations are going to live in cities. So cities might really prove quite critical in our understanding of what it means to successfully coexist with wildlife going forward into this climate changing world. So I think I'll leave it right there. And with that, I'd like to thank my funders, especially National Geographic Society, the National Science Foundation, and the Switzer Foundation, as well as my awesome Canyon field team, my undergrad research assistants, and my labs at UC Berkeley, including the Shell Lab, which I forgot to put on here, which is my new lab. And I will welcome any questions that you have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Christine. That was a wonderful talk. I guess first, we do have one question in the chat, but I'll open it up to any brave souls that might want to, Zoom face-to-face ask a question. All right, I'll go to the chat. So we have a question from Dr. Bump, who wants to know, do different hyena or coyote populations have different cultures? In other words, consistent differences in behavior between groups or populations in a species that are, maybe a consequence of social learning rather than directly caused by environmental or genetic differences.
Awesome question. Yes. So the answer for hyenas is definitely yes. There is social learning. They're actually, I didn't get to mention, I could talk about hyenas all day, but they are one of the most intelligent species in the mammal world. They've been known to outperform chimpanzees on some problem-solving tests. And that's partially because they're so social. So you'll see like hyenas in the middle, living in the middle of the Masai Mara, away from people, have very different ways of foraging and behaviors toward people than hyena clans living, say, in Soisambu Conservancy, where there used to be bounties on their head and where they also have access to a lot of livestock. So that's a great question. As far as coyotes, I've been studying coyotes since August 15th, and I have a lot to learn. But from what I have learned from my coyote expert colleagues is that there are definitely individual differences in boldness, and there is a place in Utah, USDA facility, where I believe they're actually studying that exact question about cultural differences. I'm not sure if they found anything yet, but definitely look up a woman named Dr. Julie Young. If you don't already know her, she'll have that answer for you.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, I've definitely seen that a lot too in Yellowstone with different wolf packs and their exposure to humans and crossing roads and all of that. Very different responses to people. And then we do have one comment in the chat, not a question, but from Rob Blair saying he has a great model to test that in birds if you want a project.
Amazing. What species of bird? Not that I need any more projects, but I'm curious. Don't mind speaking to that a little bit.
Actually, I was throwing that out at Joseph because I have a good model within the Twin Cities where robins and cardinals span the whole land use change. And so you've got one species, which is rare in birds, that covers any habitat type. And I've been dying to know if the city robins and the country robins are different beings. I've always been looking for a grad student to do that, or somebody else. It'd be a fun project, but it's not predator related. Yeah.
Don't worry, I don't discriminate. I have an Arctic tern on my shoulder because I used to study seabirds as my first project.
I have a question. Maybe it's a question or a comment. I was just, when you put up the Nextdoor post about the coyotes, I was like, this could totally be taken from Minneapolis, St. Paul next door every year. And I've actually been, me and my dog have been like trailed by a coyote. There's always posts about this especially when they have their little pups. But my impression is that like a lot of that behavior is not actually threatening to humans, right? It's just like, they're going to tail you to make sure you just move along, and nobody was actually going to get bitten in the throat. And so I always interpret our Nextdoor post as like, yes, this is a human wildlife conflict, but it's like, not really. Nobody's really in danger. The people just need to understand what is actually going on. And I'm wondering how you separate those things, or maybe it doesn't matter. If it's a perceived conflict by a person, then it's a conflict from a conservation point of view. But some of it is just like, understand it's just going to walk along and then it's going to go away, and nobody's dog was actually going to be attacked, even though that's what shows up on Nextdoor.
Right. These are just great complex questions. And the answer is yes. And it's exactly what you said. The perceptions are important, and they're going to influence how people, whether people choose to haze the coyote, whether people choose to fight back against conservation efforts for the coyote, all these different things. And usually, yeah, like when they're trailing you, it's usually because they're just like, get away from my pups, whatever. But there are cases like for these Golden Gate Park coyotes, like one actually had to be euthanized because it kept trying to attack toddlers in particular. And then if you look at some of the data from LA that I'm working on, like people are getting their little dogs and cats attacked and killed all the time and dragged right out of their porch. Or even we're working with this retirement community in San Jose where the elderly people are walking their dogs and they're getting attacked and eaten on a 6-foot leash. So there's like,
oh my,
different things like so Nextdoor has a lot of limitations. But what I would look at a Nextdoor comment about would be, okay, I would look at the behavior that's described and I would log it as this is the behavior, and it's like there's like a following versus an attack versus a, some sort of death of a pet, like that kind of scaling. But then I'd also look at it as like, did the person speak to having fear about this? Did they speak to being angry? Like and kind of have a few different data points that come out of that related to both coyote behavior and presence, but also related to perception and tolerance, and trying to include those both. Keeping in mind, this is a little bit of a tangent, but Nextdoor is usually posted on by people from a very specific socioeconomic bracket and demographic bracket. And so we're taking all of our Nextdoor explorations with a huge grain of salt, knowing that we're missing communities like me, like my community, right? Like Black and brown folks who are working all day long and not sitting at home watching what the wildlife are doing. So that's something to keep in mind, and definitely something that we're thinking about as we think of these citizen-sourced data sets.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you.
So we do have a couple more questions in the chat now. So we have one from Lucas saying, your data indicates that fences have been ineffective in your study sites in Kenya at keeping out or keeping in predator populations. From a policy standpoint, how are local officials choosing to interpret that data?
Yeah, so they are choosing to interpret it by attempting to devote more resources to the parts of the fence that are most breached. And so what they can do if they get enough money and resources, and they've done it on certain parts of the fence, is you put essentially like a chain link mesh that goes about 1 meter underground so that there's no more digging, which of course doesn't solve the primate problem because primates don't give a crap. They'll just go over the top. And they're able to do that in some places, but not in other parts of the fence. I mean, there's a huge flooding problem that makes that very difficult for them. But they're trying. The other thing to keep in mind is that the largest aspect for that fence being put in was to protect these rhinos, which are an endangered species. And they also have rangers that are trained to shoot to kill, like shoot on sight to kill if people are inside of the park. So they're kind of trying to keep people out and keep rhinos in more than anything else. And so when they hear about these predators, like they are mainly like, okay, how can I pitch this to get funding to help protect the rhinos more rather than to like care about the predators. And the last important point that I want to make about that fence, which is a very complex, very nuanced point, is that when I'm talking to community members about carnivores in the area, they, despite kind of knowing that there's some holes in the fence, they're like, I don't mind if carnivores live in this region as long as they are on the other side of that fence. So there's like this perception of the fence being effective, at least somewhat, that contributes to slightly more positive views about carnivores being, and I'm talking people who literally can throw a stone over this fence, are saying this. So there's something to be explored there about like, you know, fences as a socio-political symbol more than as an ecological tool, or as well as being an ecological tool, that we could go into for a long time. So I'll stop.
So I guess dovetailing off of that, I kind of had a question that might force you to talk about it a little longer. So you mentioned this kind of underpass or overpass that might be used to maybe connect Soisambu and Nakuru. Is there a lot of like local concern of that making that connection, since Soisambu has, you know, livestock and local communities that are subject to like predation from hyenas or other predators? Or is there like, I guess, more positive thoughts on it from communities that it might localize movement to one area and maybe prevent some, more conflict spread across that whole kind of fence line?
Yeah, it's a good question. So something about Soisambu that I probably glossed over by accident is that it is actually owned by the descendant of a colonialist white man. And his name, and the person who actually lives there is named Lord Delamere III. Lord Delamere III, yes. And he owns all of the livestock on that conservancy. And the people who live on that conservancy are basically the employees that herd the livestock. And also the school teachers, and there's a couple schools on there too, and their kids and all of that. So there's like hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people that live on that conservancy, but they're all like employed or families of employees of Soisambu Conservancy. And the conservancy itself actually was only set up in 2007. So there's a board that includes people representing the livestock component and people representing the conservancy. And there's a lot of interesting and upsetting tension between the two sides. So like they didn't even get those predator-proof bomas up and going until starting about 2017. When I first arrived in 2016, they were just like, these dang lions are just eating all of our thousands of cattle, and we have so much money that we could get predator-proof bomas with from the livestock side, but we're not going to do that because we just don't want predators here. And so they would translocate the predators. And that stopped in 2016 and 17. They started keeping the lions on, collaring them, tracking them, putting up these predator-proof bomas. So the answer is, like, from the Conservancy's perspective, wildlife overpass would be helpful. They're having the conversations, Kenya Wildlife Service. From the livestock's perspective, like, it needs to be able, basically the board is like, if this benefits tourism here in the Conservancy, then it'll be worth it. But if not, like, we're going to prioritize the livestock. And that's the general consensus there. So as far as local communities that are like Black Kenyan communities, I am almost certain, and having not been in the room for these corridor conversations yet, just like feeding the research in, I'm almost certain they're not being involved. And the reason I say that is because they're just never involved. And when I talk to people with my participatory mapping, they were so grateful to basically have a conduit to the government through me, because scientists are not objective, no matter how much we pretend we are. We serve roles as soft diplomats. And these people were like, this is what we've needed. Thank you for connecting us to the community warden, blah, blah. So hopefully that'll change and they will be able to be involved, but we'll see.
Great, thanks. So we do have some more questions in the chat. So one, similar to hyenas, did you ID leopards individually at fence crossings? Aaron's wondering if there are particular individuals who are exhibiting that crossing behavior.
Yeah, I haven't ID'd the leopards. Definitely something that we can do. I would say the reason I haven't is because I don't have the bandwidth to go and ID all of them in the park, and nobody's doing that work yet. So I can't base my work on anything yet as far as comparing fence crossing leopards versus not. But I would love to do that. If anyone's interested in doing that, I can definitely work with you on that.
And then you mentioned that there could be a wildlife crossing in between the park and Conservancy. Is there more community support for wildlife crossing versus decreasing the permeability of the fence? So that's kind of similar to my question.
Yeah, I think they definitely would want the fence to be less permeable in the places that they're noticing, with the caveat that a lot of community members sneak into the park to get firewood. So also no, everything's very complicated and not black and white. And I think that they'll feel relatively neutral to the wildlife crossing because it's going to be like connecting one fenced area to another mostly fenced area. And the animals are already coming into their communities no matter what. So I imagine there would be some support for, like, let's make a wildlife crossing and funnel and make the fence good enough to funnel them through it, but I'm not sure.
And then we have a question from David. How do you see your current research on coyotes as contributing to incorporating environmental justice principles into urban ecology? And what should researchers in other urban communities do to follow your lead? Great question.
Awesome question. So something that made me want to take this postdoc was because I've always been really keenly interested in connecting, like using wildlife as a storytelling tool to show how humans are faring in different landscapes and to advocate for them. Because unfortunately, many Westerners, especially, but a lot of people see animals as charismatic and don't pay attention to these sort of inequities and injustices happening with people in those same landscapes. And so I am really excited to use some of these various like sociocultural and economic and pollutant data layers to tell a story about coyotes that then links back into, okay, we care about the coyotes or the bobcats or the foxes being impacted by these pollutants and by these systemic issues. But here are the people that those animals are sharing landscapes with that are dealing with these same issues. And being able to employ our work to tell this, not just to increase coexistence and conservation, but to tell this story that sort of elevates the human story as well. So that's like sort of my broad philosophy on that.
All right, that's all we have in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions they'd want to ask?
Yeah, I guess I just have a quick question on the coyote side of things. I guess there's some evidence of like coyote wolf hybridization that occurs. And I'm interested like how you think that might influence whether or not their boldness, I guess, in coming around people, and then also the perception of that interaction by the people who are around them. Interested if you've thought about that or anybody else has.
Good question. I have not thought about it till this moment, but just thinking about it now, you've reminded me. So there is so much wolf fear, even in urban settings. On my Oakland next door recently, someone was like, I was followed by a black wolf in the near the park and blah blah, and like I was like, no, you weren't. And then I scrolled down one comment or one like post, and someone's like, I've lost my black German Shepherd. Like I was like, I think it's the German Shepherd in the post below. And like this is like, and people have a lot of fear of them because wolves are big and they have all these stories around them. But as far as like the boldness and the sort of movement and ecological links, both coyotes and wolves are generalists. So I would be curious if wolf coyote hybrids are a little smaller than wolves or have slightly different behaviors, perhaps they could thrive in cities, right? Perhaps if they live in pairs, for instance, rather than packs, maybe they could thrive in cities like coyotes do. But there's no real limitation for a theoretical wolf pack to travel through a city. So, because they're generalists, it's just they wouldn't necessarily thrive there because they're big, they're visible, and they have these large packs. So just off the top of my head, I would guess that it wouldn't make much of a difference as far as behavioral capacity and boldness, but it could make a difference as far as who stays where, as far as close to urban areas or not.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, great talk. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, it looks like we're right about at 1 o'clock. Joseph, did you have one last thing to say? Or?
Yeah, no, thanks for answering the question about carnivore cultures. A lot of the evidence on cultures and its importance for conservation is with primates and birds, Rob. They're up there, and cetaceans. But I will follow up, Dr. Wilkinson, because we have a manuscript going, and I'll invite you to join that with your expertise on hyenas, commenting on carnivore cultures in particular and their importance potentially to conservation. So
Awesome.
just watch for that email.
Great, thanks. And speaking of cultures, I don't know if you saw there was like a animal personalities influencing ecology or something paper that just came out like 4 days ago that I can try to send over to Jack maybe to share out.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, thanks again, Dr. Wilkinson. That was a really fantastic talk, a lot of really great conversation as well. I'll leave it at that. For everyone, thanks for joining and tune in for next week.
Thank you all so much.